One of the things that we men are not very good at doing is expressing our feelings. It's very true of men in general, but I suppose it's particularly true of men in Northern Ireland and in the United Kingdom, especially when it comes to expressing feelings of love towards those who are near and dear to us. It's a bit like the old farmer whose wife said to him, "Jimmy, do you still love me because you haven't told me for ages?" And the farmer replied, "Mary, didn't I tell I loved you the day that I married you?" "Well, yes, you did," said Mary, "but that was 27 years ago." "Well," said the farmer, "if anything ever changes, I'll let you know." The Apostle Paul had a warm, loving heart. He also had both the desire and the ability to express feelings of love towards those who were the objects of his love. And when you turn to this letter of Philippians, you find Paul expressing that to the Philippians. He says in verse 7, "I have you in my heart." In verse 8 he says, "God can testify how I long for all of you with the affection of Christ Jesus." The Apostle Paul didn't just have these people in his mind as he lay in his prison cell and then prayed for them. He had them in his mind because he had them in his heart. He had a deep love for these people. God had knit the heart of Paul to the heart of the Philippians to whom he had ministered. There was a time when that was most certainly not the case. In fact, there was a time when the only thing that was in Paul's heart in relation to any Christians was hatred and contempt. And that found expression, as we know from the book of Acts, in his determined pursuit and violent treatment of them. He threw them into prison, he tortured them, he arranged to have them executed, and so forth. So love for the followers of Jesus was something that was far from Paul's mind in his unsaved state. But that, of course, was something that wonderfully changed. Paul was saved by God's grace, and as a result of that dramatic intervention by God, he had experienced this love for the brethren, love for fellow believers. God had loved Paul, Paul loved God for loving him, and as a result of Paul's love for God, Paul had a love for God's people. And there's some things that I want us to think about. This was an intense love. Paul speaks of longing for the Philippians in verse 8. God can testify how I long for all of you. The translation in the King James Version is, "God is my witness how greatly I long after you." And this is a very strong expression of love for the people of God. We all know that in the Second World War, many soldiers carried in their pockets photographs of their loved ones, maybe their sweetheart, maybe their wife, maybe their children. And every time they took that photograph out, I'm sure, and looked at the picture of their loved one, love would have welled up in their hearts. They were separated from them because of the responsibilities that they were fulfilling, and they longed to be with them. Well, it was the same for the Apostle Paul. He had been separated from the Philippians, and as a result of that, his heart was going out to them. Let me ask you a question. Do you have a love for God's people? Is it a strong love? Is it something that you have for your fellow believers? As a Christian, you're meant not just to love God, you're also to love God's people. And brethren, this is something that I think is very, very important. We as God's people need to love each other more. And love isn't merely a feeling, it is seeking the good of the person whom we love, regardless of how we feel. So let us, as God's people, love one another. Paul was able to say that he greatly longed for each one of them, that he had a great love for them. Oh, that God would give us such a love for one another, a love that sadly is often missing in many congregations. May God bless our meditation upon His word today. Have a good day.